Board of Trustees of Iloilo Business Club. I would like to welcome all of you to today's session of Iloilo Business Online. We are happy to have you again with us, together with our partner, the Daily Guardian. We are thankful for the continued attendance and support. We are inspired by your perseverance and resilience amidst this pandemic. We hope that after a year of Iloilo Business Online sessions, we were able to provide a venue to engage with our various guests on topics most relevant to us. With this session, we also commemorate Iloilo Business Club's 31st anniversary. We choose to dedicate the topic of this afternoon on infrastructure, which is one of the club's major advocacies. We are grateful and honored to have with us a long-time friend from Reed Foundation, which will be properly be introduced later, and a new acquaintance from Planet Partnership, who are both involved in USAID's Deliver project. We hope our discussion this afternoon elevates our knowledge and initiative towards sustainable infrastructure development in the Philippines. We wish to welcome back and thank Ms. Rowena Diaz, the Soft Skills Management Consulting, for moderating our session this afternoon. Thank you, our Daily Guardian, for making all our IBO sessions available on your Facebook page. Lastly, we thank Concepcion Power Corporation and Seda Atrial Hotel for unwavering support to Iloilo Business Online. We wish you all a great afternoon ahead and let us all keep practicing our health protocols. Thank you. Stay safe and good afternoon again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamora. Your leadership is nothing short of an asset to the Iloilo Business Club, and your effort with the support of the board made a remarkable difference, and we can thank you enough for all the contributions that you give freely to Iloilo City. Okay, so the Philippines now increase the spending on the roads, the bridges, the air, the seaports, and other large-scale projects in the recent years. And then we are aware that public infrastructure investment rose with the target of raising the ratio to over 6% by 2022. And then as infrastructure development remains the priority and thrust of the Philippine government, it is expected that private and public partnerships will pave way to a remarkable infra development. So each guest speaker today will have a total of 30 minutes for the presentation, and we will hold most questions until the end of the session. And I will then read questions for the speakers to answer as time permits. And our first speaker will share his insights on the importance of sustainability, resiliency, and biodiversity in the construction industry. Okay, so without much further ado, I would like to introduce to you our first guest speaker. He is an economist, an investment banker, an environmentalist, a CEO, an entrepreneur, a historian, and adventurer. He has advised governments, financial institutions, and corporations for over 25 years on all aspects of economic policy, public and private partnership, and green, blue, and digital finance, founder and president of Planet Partnership LLC, founder and former president of the Institute for Public-Private Partnership in Washington, D.C., the leading advisory firm on PP partnership, which she grew and then sold to publicly traded environmental infrastructure leader Tetra Tech or Nasdaq T-Tech, credited with coining and mainstreaming the term public-private partnerships. He has advised over 120 countries on all aspects of PPP investments, green financing, and negotiation of transactions in all infrastructure sectors. He specializes in uniquely impactful environmental and urban development investments and has been lead advisor on general landmark PPP initiatives, including the Malaysian, Mexican, Brazilian, and Indonesian programs, and the National Treasury PPP program in South Africa. His design of some of the first PPP units in emerging markets have resulted in over $30.1 billion on infrastructure investments and are now entering the era of green, blue, and digital transactions with an emphasis on climate change, resilience, and new technology. He has drafted pioneering enabling legislation in over 30 countries and advised several heads of state and ministers on policy reform. Prior to establishing Planet Partnerships, he worked in Asia for the World Bank, managed an investment banking firm in London and Mexico City, and advised National Geographic, the World Wildlife Fund, and private equity funds on debt for nature swaps and innovative financing schemes for ecotourism, conservation, and historic preservation projects worldwide. He received his MS in International Economics from the George Washington University and his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Colorado and his diploma in Urban Studies from Harvard University. He also has professional degrees and certificates in history from the Catholic University in Salvador, Brazil, and the University of London, and was fellow at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii. He is a coach and a mentor for several startups and incubators in the ASEAN region, and he is on the board of several companies, foundations, and charities, including Goals for Support Impact, Grassroots Soccer, Best Timor or Better Timor, and he manages a scholarship fund for children for low-income communities in East Indonesia so they can afford college and study environmental economics to preserve ecosystems for future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, I am really very honored to introduce to you our first guest speaker, Mr. Matthew Hensley.
Thank you so much, Rowena, and thank you so much, Mr. Hamora. My welcome to all of our friends and participants in Iloilo and around the Philippines, perhaps. Jackie, are you going to be able to show the slides here? Okay. Let's see where we are. I'll just wait until the slide comes up. And in the meantime, thank you again for that kind introduction. It's far too long and too detailed, so you're very kind. And congratulations to Iloilo Business Club on its 30th anniversary. That's quite an accomplishment. If we can begin the slide presentation, I'd like to perhaps give everyone a minute just to go through the highlight of our discussion today. Next slide, please. The presentation that we'd like to provide today is just a quick overview of many of the trends that are occurring in the sustainability field today. Of course, it's so relevant with all of the events of the last week and this week in Rome and in Glasgow with the COP26. Today, what we really want to do is take a quick tour of what are the key trends in the ASEAN region that are occurring in infrastructure in general and sustainable infrastructure and finance in particular. Some of these key trends are focused on the core issues of sustainability that of course affect the Philippines, and then try to provide some insight on the markets that are moving and developing around financing some of these trends. And what's most important is the response of government to provide the incentive framework. And this response is common amongst all governments in the region, not just at the national level, but local governments as well. And that gets us to looking more carefully at what types of financial instruments are there to promote infrastructure development, to promote more sustainability, and the impacts it has on the local economy and local business, like in the construction industry. And then lastly, I'd like to take a few minutes just to talk briefly about the experience of Singapore recently, where I'm based. For all my friends in the Philippines, I've spent a lot of time working in the Philippines over the years. It's one of my favorite places. My heart goes out to everybody there during this difficult pandemic. I've been in Singapore during the pandemic, and we've been recently going through our own version of lockdowns after having a relatively safe and secure first 16 months. And I'm usually based in Bali, so I'm a member of the the region, and looking forward to my return to the Philippines as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So the trends that I think are most interest to our group today, the Business Club, really are dynamic, and they don't really only come about obviously from the pandemic, but they've been accelerated during the pandemic. And some of these key trends are really about what we call the green, blue, and digital economy. That's really what's happening in the sustainability and in the financial world today. It's the acceleration of these fast-growing trends to move towards green, blue, and digital economy from the public and the private sector's perspective. As we know, the ASEAN region is the fastest growing economic region in the world. It's a home to 600 million consumers. There's a massive $400 billion ASEAN digital economy, which has implications for every member of ASEAN. And as we know, because ASEAN today is a economic bloc and an economic zone, what happens in Indonesia affects what happens in the Philippines, and what happens in Singapore affects what's going on in the Philippines. And those are markets as well. So it's really important to understand the intra-regional dynamics of some of these trends. And as I said, COVID, interestingly, has accelerated innovation to move towards these trends and to identify solutions. But we have to realize, as we know, that there's great attention has to be placed on the equity and the equality side of things, because we're already seeing the inequality of the digital divide, and COVID is also accelerating that, as I'm sure all of you in the Philippines are well aware. But these trends represent huge opportunities for us, and even during this time, we've seen the global investment community as well as the local investment community respond to these objectives, these trends of trying to be more sustainable, trying to raise capital for viable projects in this green, blue, digital economy. For example, in Singapore, to the surprise of many, once COVID hit, there was a massive amount of capital inflows to the region and into Singapore through equity and debt financing, mostly in the innovation and environmental space. So there's a lot going on in the markets, and some of these issues we'll talk about today. But most importantly, each country really has to develop its own incentive framework to attract capital and to make these partnerships happen. And the Philippines has a great first start when it comes to its legal and regulatory framework, but it has a ways to go. And now we have to modify and modernize those frameworks, because so much has happened in the last 18 months, especially in the green finance, what's called the ESG field, but mostly just between the public and private sector developing joint strategies to take advantage of these markets. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. On the topic of climate change, which of course is so relevant for everybody, it's important to understand the massive amounts of capital that's required. It's estimated that it could be anywhere between 1.7 trillion to 2.5 trillion per year just in Asia itself. And remember, the climate change and the response to climate change isn't really just about renewable energy, even though that's what a lot of people think it's about. It's really about many other sectors as well, and all of the inputs that are required to make those sectors viable. So we're talking about steel, cement, mining, buildings, construction, marine and coastal, agriculture. The list is endless. So the circular economy is critical, but it's the materials and inputs that go into the greening of sustainability that's also part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution. The numbers about what climate change could mean in terms of global financial assets are quite alarming. the risk out there in terms of damage isn't just to human beings and to biodiversity, but it's to financial assets. There's a massive amounts of up to $25 trillion, it's estimated, is at risk if we actually don't put in the measures that are needed to make our economies and our infrastructure more resilient. So green finance is moving, though. The good news is it's moving. It's already happening in a lot of countries. It's happening globally, and it's a global market. So even if a country is behind in green finance, it can quickly catch up as long as the government sends the right signals and the private sector responds. Ironically, Asia is where the greatest demand for green finance and for infrastructure in general is, yet it's actually behind North America and Europe when it comes to these ecosystems, these green finance ecosystems. But China, Japan, and Korea and Singapore are leading the way within Asia. But the Philippines and Indonesia, two of the largest economies in ASEAN, have so much more potential because the demand for resilient infrastructure and for the greening of the economy is so great, but it really requires a public and private policy response. Next, please. So just a quick look at a couple of the key trends. In the green economy, as I mentioned, it's not just about energy, although energy is massive. It's really about transportation. It's about agriculture. It's about the built environment, and many of the trends towards developing new infrastructure and recalibrated and repurposed infrastructure are already happening in our economies, and Asia is well placed to attract not just finance but the type of technology needed. Interestingly, on the green finance side, there's a lot happening in terms of financial innovation that we'll talk about later. But organizations like MasterCard has already issued massive corporate bonds and corporate paper to attract other investors into the space in Asia. Indonesia has raised a $1.2 billion green bond, even though they didn't have much of a bond market. So there's a lot of financial innovation as well as demand for the infrastructure assets themselves. People think that green is mostly about urban and energy, as I've said, but don't forget the blue economy. The blue economy, especially within Asia, is a vitally important part of the economy, especially as it relates to jobs. You all know in the Philippines how many people live in coastal areas, their contribution to economic activity, and the fact that they also generally are lower income. So there's a lot of investment needed in the blue economy. And the blue economy doesn't just mean sustainable fishing. It really means coastal communities developing their blue infrastructure and their marine infrastructure and attracting the type of capital in to archipelago and island regions and nations and coastal areas. And in that regard, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and even private banks are starting to respond by targeting investments and trying to raise private finance for what we call the blue economy or blue financial instruments. And then lastly, we all know the digitization is the word of the day. It's changing everything. It's accelerating everything. But a lot of countries are behind when it comes to digitization. There's so much more that can be done. There's so much that the government can do to encourage companies to become digitized and also to help lower and middle income people not be left behind in terms of digital access. So these are the big trends going on in the region. And I think that they're obviously relevant to all of you interested in this topic in the Philippines. And as you can see in that last note, DTI expects that e-commerce has got so much potential in the Philippines. But in order for e-commerce to flourish in the Philippines and for investors and firms to be attracted to the Philippines, we need to find ways to offer logistics and warehouses and facilities so that e-commerce firms can invest and create investment hubs that make the Philippines a logistical center. Otherwise, e-commerce really won't come to a market. It doesn't really matter how big the market is. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea, the infrastructure financing gap, this is a kind of a look at emerging markets, but the numbers that are required to address existing and new infrastructure are massive. The numbers in Asia are massive. So there's a lot of capital that has to be raised, and of course the public sector is not in the position to do it themselves, but the private sector won't do it themselves unless they find common cause with government to create the type of project environment, regulatory environment, and investment environment to make their investments sound, especially since infrastructure, as you all know, is a long-term financial commitment. So we need long-term financial policies, and we need long-term financial instruments. And that the good news is that's the type of capital opportunities that investors are interested in the sustainability space. Next, please. So here are the four big trends. I think we can just jump right into it, but most of them have to do with the dynamics of everything from the demography of countries in the Asian region, the economic and environmental vulnerability, and just what the investment climate is like. Let's take a look at the next slide, and we can go in quickly to each one of these trends, please. Next slide. Okay, so I'm sorry, slide before it. There's a small delay. Thank you. So the first trend is urbanization and the emergence of smart cities. It doesn't really matter how big the city is, but and this is more true in Asia than elsewhere, but it's a global trend. You know, ASEAN is urbanizing quickly. Most of the mega cities in the world are in Asia or will be in Asia. We all know in the Philippines, there's a high growth of urbanization, which is problematic, but it's just a fact. And of course, that translates also in terms of the impact on the environment. You know, cities are responsible for over 75% of all carbon emissions, with transport and buildings being the major source of that. And infrastructure is stressed around the world in urban areas, but it's ready for disruption. So within this problem are actually many opportunities for smart and agile firms in the Philippines and elsewhere. Smart transport and energy efficiency buildings can unlock savings. There's a lot of cost reduction that we can get. It's not just about new investment, it's about lower cost, but it becomes a financing issue if we're going to unlock those investments. Everybody's talking about EV, electric vehicles, and what that means. It's actually, for all the talk, it's actually a very, very small part of market penetration. As you know, there's a lot of talk in China about it. Indonesia is actually trying to embark on it in a big way, but they've already are struggling with trying to get the basic part of the infrastructure equation in terms of roads and efficiency, maintenance. But the EV story is a very exciting one. It's going to happen. It's already happening, and it's really a precursor to the sharing economy that I think we're all seeing around the world with a lot of different companies, a lot of different economies. So the future really won't be people owning their own electric vehicles and buses. It's really going to be about sharing those vehicles, which is actually exciting. But you can imagine what the infrastructure challenges are to that scenario. But that's an interesting and important part of the trend. These transactions, all of them require an ecosystem, which we'll talk about later. But just to give you an example, because it's an opportunity, especially for those of you in the construction and infrastructure side of things, look at just in the small case of Singapore, which is a small country with a small population, they're building 60,000 charging stations in the next 5 years, and all public buildings are going to have to be net zero by 2030. And that's going to be obviously electrified, which has a lot of implications on the local construction industry to meet the opportunity to build all that infrastructure. And then, of course, housing and new construction is going to be disrupted worldwide. So a lot of this is not just a trend towards green and urbanization and smart cities, but it's because consumers and citizens are actually demanding these changes. And I see that in every country that I work in. And I think it's obviously true in the Philippines as well. Next slide, please. The other trend is decarbonization on the green and blue side. We all know about the targets that every country's shooting for, the target of 23%. We know that even the private sector is calling for higher targets to meet in terms of renewable energy and the transition away from fossil fuels. But it's a complicated story. But we know that decarbonization is happening not just in the energy space; it's happening in all types of areas. And green finance is at the forefront of trying to meet that challenge by offering financial products that incentivize and are targeted towards resilient infrastructure. But in order to receive green finance, projects have to be compliant, projects have to be eligible. And there's a huge problem around the world. And I think it's true in the Philippines of it's very unclear if projects will be eligible for green finance because there are many steps needed to make those projects and those investments eligible. We'll come back to that later. But within green finance, we need to understand that it's a market. And there needs to be market makers to validate and verify that these projects, be it a construction loan or an energy efficient building or an infrastructure asset, they all have to be validated and certified in order to be commercially compliant. And in the case of Singapore, for example, Singapore is deciding that it wants to be a hub for green finance. And I think the truth is each country within ASEAN will likely have their own hubs. And I think the Philippines will emerge as a hub as well for its own green ecosystem. It's an interesting topic and we could talk about it for a long time, but we'll see that green finance follows high quality projects. And so the focus needs to be on the policy environment and then on the validation of good investment projects. And then similarly, the blue economy is got a different market perspective because the blue economy is about decarbonization of coastal assets, marine assets, nature assets. And so it's really important to identify ways in which we can decarbonize coastal communities. For example, we all know about mangroves and their amazing power of carbon sequestration. So it's really important to not forget the blue economy. Next slide. And then, of course, and I think this is very relevant for the Philippines, but there's major trends and disruption going on in agriculture. And even though this is not urban, this is interurban because most of the land in most countries in ASEAN, most of the land that's habitable is already used for agriculture. And of that, a huge percentage is for livestock. So, the contribution of agriculture to unsustainable practices is overweight. And we need to, and it's already happening in a lot of countries, we need to disrupt agriculture. And it's happening when you just look at the numbers, the amount of energy, the amount of water it takes to produce, the agriculture as we know it, or as my parents used to know it, is just enormous. Look at that number. 1,800 gallons of water just to produce 1 pound of meat. I mean, that's just not sustainable. So what we're seeing in agriculture is the food tech market is already viewed by many investors as a booming, exciting market. But how do you disrupt it? Well, it's mostly being disrupted now in consumer behavior. We all saw in the pandemic how important and popular delivery was, and how that's now got backward linkages to the farm. And we're seeing direct to consumer platforms where disruption is occurring from the farm to the consumer in cities, and the bioengineered products to replace typical agricultural products. But this is a very dynamic and much bigger sector than most people realize. But of course, it relies heavily on infrastructure and logistics in order to keep the agricultural value chains viable and dynamic. It takes a lot of investment, not just in the agricultural sector per se, but on the infrastructure that moves and stores agriculture between buyers and sellers along the value chain. And just a quick note there, to show you how interesting this sector is, the former CEO of Uber, when he was resigned from Uber, the very first capital that he raised for his new company was in the ag tech sector, and with a focus on Asia, with this whole phenomenon towards plant-based proteins. So that's a big trend that we also need to watch. And then the final trend, next slide. I think we can pass on this slide. It's just kind of a summary of the big trends, but the final trend, no less important, I'm sure you're all aware, and it's even more relevant today than it was even a month ago. And that's the whole issue of supply chain relocation and disruption. When the pandemic began, it was all about supply chains moving from China south to other parts of Southeast Asia. That was for political reasons. It was for economic reasons, for safety reasons. And that's a trend that continues as the global supply chains start to shift and the post-COVID world starts to emerge. Companies around the world are seeing that they can't just rely on one supplier, and they can't be vulnerable to one geography like in China or even Japan or elsewhere. So there's all this supply chain competition going on around the world and around the region, as you all know. And the Philippines is right there in the heart of it. But right now, because it's a competitive environment, and going forward, as those supply chains move, not just in the electronics and the computer chips and in the processing industries, but it's happening in the automotive industry, in the robotics industry, in the light manufacturing industry, even in the agricultural industry. As these supply chains relocate and move, they're making decisions about where to relocate based on a number of factors: labor cost, logistics readiness, quality of infrastructure. And if you actually took a poll of top CEOs around the world, and we have actually done this with top 200 CEOs, not just American, but European, Asian, and American, interestingly, they cite quality of infrastructure as the number one factor in their decision. Closely, it used to be that poll, if you had asked that poll 10 years ago, it would have been labor cost. But today, people realize that labor costs are fluid across sectors and across regions. It's all about the quality of infrastructure, and interestingly, the quality of the workforce, the education and the ability and the capability of the workforce. So in the region, it's actually been Singapore and Vietnam who in the last 12 months have emerged as the winners in the supply chain relocation business, with the Philippines and Indonesia actually not doing as well as they could. But it's early in the game. This is a long-term game. But the interesting thing about this is Singapore and Vietnam both have big limitations, which give hope to the Philippines and Indonesia and other countries in the region. Singapore has got limitations, obviously, in terms of land. There's only so many factories and so many high-tech industrial parks that you could build in a place like Singapore. And then Vietnam has limitations on their costs are rising. They don't have an English language workforce that's capable in high-level management services. Their logistics maybe and their location maybe isn't as good as others. So there's a lot going on in the supply chain game. And then lastly, the green finance is looking for opportunities to invest in new supply chain relocation, and the implications for the construction and the infrastructure and the e-commerce business is really fierce, but it's a good opportunity. But again, projects have to meet standards if they're going to attract not just the type of investor, but to be called a green project that's eligible for this type of financing. Next slide, please. So just a quick word about the competitive advantage of the Philippines. A big part of it that's already a good thing is that as a member of ASEAN, there's already a lot of regional pull in terms of investment allocation. You know, a lot of investors want to be in Asia. A lot of investors want to be where the big markets are. A lot of investors want to invest in an ASEAN country because it gives them access to the bigger ASEAN market. So signing up and being part of a lot of these regional agreements is already in place, but there's a lot more work to be done. But the Philippines is in a good position, and local governments and local communities like Iloilo are actually in a good position to build on, take advantage of some of these inherent qualities, such as economic and political stability, super good strategic location within the dynamic interface between China and the US, regional linkages, this could be improved, quality of infrastructure, this could be improved, very good skilled and educated workforce, but that could be improved because a lot of the jobs that that we're trying to develop require a different type of skilled and educated workforce, and they require them to be on site, not overseas. And then, of course, we need to make sure that our enabling environment and our policy environment is aggressive and sound and pro business, but also, you know, pro business, pro investment, but pro Philippines. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of a snapshot of the trend in sustainable finance. Just to give you, I mean, you can see right there, it's growing year on year. After COP26, believe me, there's so much going on with every bank, every investor, every ESG investor, every development bank is trying to get into sustainable finance, and the liquidity in the market is higher than ever. So really, there won't be a problem with raising finance in terms of the amounts globally, or even for projects at a subnational level. The real opportunity is, the real need is to make sure projects are viable, they're eligible, and they're structured correctly. Next slide. Same thing here. This just shows you a mix of the different types of investments between what we typically see that very generally is the instruments are, long-term loans, long-term bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds. These are all the general types of green financing that we're seeing around the world emerge. But it's interesting, the percentage of commercial bonds as you can see is growing. Well, they're all growing, but the point is there's a nice space between commercial finance and sustainable finance and what's called blended finance, which is where public and official donors also contribute to the financing of a project to make it even more commercially attractive. And it's blended finance that will probably be highlighted in the Philippines. Getting that money down to the local government level is a challenge, and getting that money down to the project level is a challenge, but that's where a lot of the hard work has to go in terms of project analysis and attracting the entrepreneurs to do these kinds of programs. Next slide, please. So I mentioned it's important to understand that sustainable infrastructure and sustainable finance in each country has its own ecosystem, and without one part of the ecosystem, it's difficult to see how a country will be competitive, right? Because it's mostly about competition. So that ecosystem really relies on the market participants. And in the Philippines and Indonesia and India, all throughout Asia, everybody's working on their ecosystem, but it's definitely incomplete in a lot of countries. So the ecosystem is made up of the traditional banks, the traditional commercial banks and institutional investors. It's made up of donor funding, or what is called ODA in the Philippines. It's made up of existing instruments like green and blue bonds, or some of the pioneers in financing these types of projects. But down there at the bottom of the slide, you see third-party verification, standards, due diligence, and then ESG compliance. These are the essential parts of the ecosystem. These are the third-party organizations and firms and lawyers and accountants who validate that projects meet the standards that are required by the lenders or by the investors. Without that, it's very difficult to qualify for this type of financing, and the cost of capital is lower. If your project is eligible, you're going to get a longer term and a lower interest rate, and be able to attract co-financiers. So that's the goal of the ecosystem. But you can see where the policy and regulatory incentive part of this circle shows, without the policy framework to make the ecosystem work, it's going to be a struggle. So we really need to work on our policy and regulatory incentives and be as forward-looking as possible, because think about this whole industry. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, most of this didn't even exist. So everybody's playing catch up, and it's an exciting field. Next slide, please. So I mentioned blended finance. This just gives you an idea of what blended finance is, what the trend is. It's gone down a little bit because of the pandemic, but blended finance is the type of finance that requires a lot of different participants. It doesn't really discriminate by sector. Like I said, you could do energy efficient buildings, you could do cold storage, you could do schools and hospitals, you could do, as long as the project has got a low carbon footprint, and as long as the project has social impact, positive social impact, which is critical, then blended finance is increasingly going to be available even at the subnational level. Again, the challenge is getting this down to the subnational level or the urban level, the municipal level, which I think is an exciting opportunity that municipal leaders need to also think about. Next slide, please. And I'll just close quickly with just a quick snapshot of how progressive Singapore has been, which they're really good at. But I think they're really good at it because it's not because it's a small country and they've got a lot of financial institutions and all the attributes that we talk about when Singapore usually scores high on all these competitiveness indices. But the real reason Singapore, I think, is ahead in this field, it's really because they had the vision and they decided to have a whole of government approach to this vision. It didn't matter how small the market was, because their vision is to not just have sustainable infrastructure in Singapore. Their vision is to support countries in the region and export their services and their products and their techniques to the region. So Singapore's green finance plan is basically the strategy and the vision for a whole ecosystem for sustainable infrastructure. Those are the numbers on this little flow chart. But basically, they're trying to already they've launched in the last couple of years a large number of green infrastructure projects. They've already launched a green bond market. They've created the ecosystem for this. They're developing pilot projects to crowd in global investors, and they're trying to do it all within the framework of aggressive targets to meet in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas and all this. Next slide, please. The green finance part of the plan, it's part of what's called the green plan. It's made up of different components, but the green finance part of the plan involves the development of a green bond market, and they encourage companies by offering grants to companies to determine if their projects are eligible for green bonds. They started thinking that these would only be for big infrastructure, and then they realized that they really should get into small projects. So they reduced the size of the scheme to cover projects that are even as low as $20 million. They launched a green loan scheme to also attract companies so that companies can receive grants from the government, small grants, some of them are small, to develop project ideas, to pay for feasibility studies. And then they've developed a platform for sharing amongst companies and amongst the government. And they've developed a bond facility, which may or may not be, I think it actually is very interesting for the Philippines, but the bond, the long-term capital market is already responded. Next slide, please. And then just to give you a quick idea, in Singapore and within Asia, over 50% of all the Asian green projects to date, interestingly, are not energy or transport. So far, they've mostly been green buildings, retrofitting and building new green buildings, energy efficient buildings. And so the green finance program in Singapore has been aimed primarily at big infrastructure assets and a lot of commercial green buildings, and every public building, every single public building has got to be green, and it represents a big opportunity. And then, as I mentioned before, this is what green finance needs. It needs standards, it needs certification, and it needs deal flow. And Singapore has created a comfortable and welcoming ecosystem to attract organizations and firms and rules that bring in those services. Next slide. This is just a quick snapshot of the green bond program, but it's a massive program to fund public-private infrastructure. But even though Singapore has got a AAA credit rating, it doesn't mean that other countries couldn't do something similar. They have a lot of advantages, of course, but this is something that if you're interested in, I'm sure Ronnie and I can follow up with you, but there's relevance here on national level and subnational level green bond issuance, and Singapore has already launched their first few projects. And of course, they all have to be climate proof, resilient, long-term. And then the next two more slides, please. Next slide. We all know they in order to meet the energy efficiency goals of all the buildings and the green buildings, Singapore, as the Philippines, has a green mark building certification program. They've had it for a while. They just upgraded it because it needs to be upgraded every year to make sure that all the green buildings actually comply. If you do comply, you get certified. And if you're certified, you have to meet this rigid criteria of eligibility in order to get this certification. But if you do get certified, it means that your project and the developers will have access to a greater pool of debt and grants and equity and insurance at a lower cost. Note that the criteria includes things like the use of digital technology, like the building's got to be smart. It can't just be green. It has to cover the whole life cost of carbon. It's got to have interesting maintenance features, and it's got to be resilient and use as much as possible natural products and natural solutions. And then lastly, we have one more. This is just a summary of some of the programs that Singapore uses to promote resilient infrastructure and green finance. They have innovation grant programs. They have a built environment accelerator. They have a built environment robotics program connected to the universities. They have a Cities of Tomorrow R&D program trying to train entrepreneurs and give them grants and access to finance. They have a loan program that provides for the cost of all of the due diligence in order to qualify for a loan. And then they have a public sector construction productivity fund that covers the cost up to 80% of the cost of any company in the construction industry that needs to digitize. The Singapore fund will pay for the cost of consultants and others to help them digitize their own industry up to a certain amount. And then the last, just a quick example of the green loan program. It's a grant program that covers up to $100,000 to pay for the cost of experts and lawyers to confirm that your loan application would be eligible, your investment plan, your business plan for a given project would be green. And in order to verify that it would be green, the grant will cover the cost of the loan application and the due diligence. It'll pay $180,000 with a cap, and it'll provide loans of up to $20 million. And they just launched this week the largest loan to date has come on the market. So this is a program that's already been spending a lot of money accelerating the green transition. So I think that's a good place to stop. I hope this gave you a bit of a rapid tour and a lot of things to think about, and I'm excited for any discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matthew Hensley, President of Planet Partnerships and Senior Consultant of USAID Deliver Project. Thank you for that remarkable presentation. And we actually salute you and your team for believing that governments and the private sector can and should work in partnership to create a vibrant communities and sustainable infrastructure. What struck me most when you discuss about a meaningful part of your discussion was when you mentioned a detailed agenda for the blue and then the green economy, that it should help to achieve the Green Deal's objectives, that truly the green and blue economy contributes to climate change mitigation, and by developing green infrastructure, we will be able to preserve biodiversity and landscapes while benefiting tourism and then, of course, the economy of the world. And then I also like when you mentioned that the system plays a very vital role in development, because the fact that it is multidisciplinary and cross-sectoral in its essence, it's both a challenge and an opportunity for stakeholders, for the government, and that the sustainable infrastructure framework is truly built around interdependent principles like the economics, financial, environmental, social, and institutional. Very, very intensive. Now, if you have questions for Mr. Hensley, please add them in the chat box, and we'll be able to answer some of the questions during the Q&A at the end. And any questions we can't actually get to can be answered in a chat feature in the conference platform for this session, or you can connect with the speaker one-on-one through a private message or meeting if you have an access with him. Thank you very much, Mr. Hensley. We will get back to you during the open forum. Okay. Now allow me to introduce our next guest speaker, because we do not have enough time, and as much as we would like to stretch our webinar this afternoon. He is a part-time member of the faculty of both the School of Economics and School of Management of the University of Asia and the Pacific, where he teaches macroeconomics, business economics, and principles of forecasting. He is a licensed urban and regional planner and an infrastructure and logistics specialist with more than 15 years of strong record in delivering high-impact reforms. He serves as the vice president of Reed Foundation, when they advised and assisted DPWH in the design, planning, and implementation of the now successful infrastructure convergence programs of DPWH, with the Department of Tourism, of course, on local tourism roads, with DTI on roads connecting eco zones and logistic hubs, with the National Defense on military facilities, and with the Philippine National Police on upgrading police stations. His team in Reed, under another USAID project, also assisted DPWH in the effort to have a new right-of-way act legislated, including the appropriate implementing rules and regulations agency manual and training for right-of-way officers and staff. So because of the new law, government is now mandated to offer the fair market value as determined by interdependent or independent licensed property appraisers, including government and then financial institutions, instead of offering zonal value that is usually rejected by private owners and delaying the critical infrastructure. He was one of the writers of the Philippine Construction Industry Roadmap in 2020 to 2030, launched last 2019, and was one of the advisors in the Philippine E-commerce Roadmap 2020 to 2022. He is now the team leader of the infrastructure component of the new USAID project called Delivering Effective Government for Competitiveness and Inclusive Growth, or DELIVER, where his team is just transformed the pickup contractor's license process into a full digital end-to-end online experience. He has a master's in industrial economics and finishing his dissertation for his doctorate in urban and regional planning with specialization in transportation planning. He obtained a certificate in business analytics from the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton Business School, and certificate on digital transformation in government from the Harvard Kennedy School. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Ronilo Balbiran.
Good afternoon, Ms. Rowena, and thank you very much for that very generous introduction. So let me share my screen because we are running out of time. So okay. So this is the outline of my presentation. Let me quickly discuss the Philippine economy and the construction industry, impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see my slides now. So, and then the positive and the negative impact, and then outlook for the construction and infrastructure sector. So let me quickly run you through. You've had, I think, several briefings about this, but I will just run through some of the basic items in relation to construction and infrastructure. As you all know, the Philippines is at the center of world's geographic challenges. No? So we are part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, and that makes us very, very vulnerable on all the types of calamity belts, earthquake belts, typhoon belts, name it. We have all the calamities. At the same time, the same source of our geographic and climate change risks are the same sources of tourism destinations that contribute to national income. So conclusion, we really need to build our infrastructure that will both support our revenue generation capacity, and at the same time protecting our economy and our communities. So at the same time, all over the world, before the pandemic, engineering and construction sector has been slow in adopting new technologies and innovation. So, on the average, the construction industry accounts for 6% of the global economy, the global GDP, and thus small improvement would incur significant benefits for the society. In our own analysis in READ and with PCA and DTI, so construction industry is actually second to the least productive sectors of our economy. This is only second to the whole agricultural sector. So therefore, digitization and modernization are foundational requirements to increase the productivity of the construction industry. Makikita nyo po ito that the way we did banking 50 years ago and now how we do banking right now are totally different. But in construction, imagine a construction activity 50 years ago and a construction activity now. There's not much of a difference, no? So and thus there's a lot of other costs of doing business, inefficiencies, etc., that actually haunt our construction industry. Nonetheless, as you can see in this chart, construction, the amount of opportunities in building our economy, our communities all over the country has actually registered the highest growth rate for the construction industry. It is the only business sector that registered double-digit growth in the last 5 years before the pandemic. So it grew the fastest and led the strong growth of the Philippine economy. And by the way, despite the low productivity and state of digitalization of the construction industry. If taken from another perspective, this is a bubble chart of our sectors, business sectors of our economy. So practically before the COVID, 2019, no? So 2014 to 2019, we were practically having a party. No? Our economy was having a party, and the leader of all the party goers is the construction industry, registering at more than 10%. With the exception of the agriculture. No? So before the pandemic, the country, the Philippines, all the sectors were having a party except agriculture. This particular chart already gives us a peek of the future. Now, if we are able to digitalize construction and at the same time modernize and digitalize agriculture, we have so much to achieve in terms of economic productivity and economic growth for the benefit of everyone. Isipin nyo na lang, if this particular agricultural sector moves just a little bit to the right, and how much can it actually push the rest of all these bubbles, no? Remember, manufacturing, more than 50% of manufacturing is food manufacturing. More than 50% of trade is actually food-related trade. And actually, you still have here accommodation and food service activities. And so, therefore, there's a lot of economic activities that can be generated by agriculture moving to the right. And that particular agricultural growth can only be supported as well by a digitalization, modernization of construction industry as well. No? So, what is construction industry? So, let me just quickly run you through the relative importance of the construction industry. So, the construction industry is part of this part of the investment spending of GDP. Construction industry is worth 3.3 trillion pesos. 16.8 or 17% of our 19.5 trillion economy before the pandemic. Okay, so and we are talking about construction, and then where is infrastructure? Where is build? No? So 75% of construction is private. So 2.5 trillion pesos of that is actually private. So private sector is actually 4 times the size of the government infrastructure program. So and then in this particular case, this will already demonstrate to you the amount of collaboration that should happen between public or government infrastructure program and the private sector, because always, no, though government is just 25%, it is the leader in terms of opening up underdeveloped areas. And once you've actually constructed roads, bridges, ports, and airports in that particular sleeping town, then private sector will suddenly rush going to that particular area and build the superstructures, the stores, the houses, the factories, and then later on the malls, etc. So you have that particular whole construction industry, and then it's divided between public and private. And that's why in March of 2019, both the government through the DTI, Construction Industry Authority of the Philippines, and the Philippine Constructors Association, public and private collaboration, drew their joint roadmap, the Philippine Construction Industry Roadmap, that outlined, no, an opportunity. If we work together, there's an opportunity of 130 trillion worth of construction projects over the next 10 years. No? This was prior to the pandemic. However, may I tell you that this particular opportunity, potential, has not actually diminished. No? So after the pandemic, after we have actually vaccinated ourselves, I still believe that that particular potential, if we work together, is still worth 130 trillion and perhaps even bigger now because of the rosy picture that Sir Matt Hensley has described to us just a while ago. So, and then combine it with what Sir Matt Hensley mentioned to us about e-commerce. No, so I'm proud to share with you some collaborative effort. No, with DTI. No, I was part of this particular roadmap together with the construction industry roadmap. So that I will point you to the ecommerce.dti.gov.ph/madali. Madali. So that's the name of the e-commerce roadmap. Madali. Market access, digitalization, and logistics integration. Madali. So prior to the pandemic, we can already see the power of e-commerce to unlock the potentials of Filipinos' ingenuity and entrepreneurship to help our economy to grow even faster. So that's three. We call it 3S. 3S equals S. No, speed, security, and structure will be equal to sales, and those are the driving forces of our economy. No? So, however, we all know, no, I don't need to belabor the point that there is a huge negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But let me share with you this slide, the Philippine economy in 2020. No? So total impact of COVID-19 to our GDP per industry. So you see that all the industries went to the left, except government, public administration and defense, information and communication, and financial and insurance activities. So basically, this is a result of locking down our economy, locking down our consumers and our producers, and this is the result. Okay, so but I'm very bullish that once we have opened up our economy, these industries that are very much dependent on mobility can easily, not easily, that can bounce back stronger than what was impacted on them by the pandemic. No? So, and while that was happening, there was the pandemic was actually a blessing in disguise. No? The more than 20 years of effort of digitalizing the construction industry and the infrastructure sector has actually been accelerated by the pandemic. So, as you can see in this McKinsey study way back last year, around October, so the future of construction, you can see the constellation, they call it the constellation of potential expansion of the construction industry, the engineering and the infrastructure in terms of opportunities and revenues and cost savings. So makikita nyo dito yung number 20. What is number 20? 20 is the largest of it is document management. As simple as document management can actually save you a lot of cost, and this has something to do with our sustainability as well. No? So you really save a lot of trees with digitalization of document management, monitoring of construction work. And then as we become more complex, no, in terms of digital twins, 3D printing, modularization, robotics, artificial intelligence and analytics, supply chain optimization in marketplaces. So the numbers are really staggering. And I'm very thankful that Sir Matt has actually outlined for us the estimates of those numbers that we are talking about from the point of view of business. No? And that's why in our USAID Deliver project, we immediately, during the pandemic, we immediately worked with the DTI CIAP PICAP, the Philippine Constructors Accreditation Board, to digitalize the licensing system of our country, to enable our construction companies to be able to renew their licenses online without going to any DTI regional office or going to the Jupiter Street of Makati to renew their license. And in fact, we have also digitalized the process of applying for a new construction license. And we're very happy to see that that we have actually seen an increase, a substantial increase in the renewals and the new applications for construction licenses. And by the way, a tremendous more than 100% increase in contractors registering for government infrastructure projects. So if you're interested to go into construction, or you know someone who wants to get into construction business, encourage them to apply for a legitimate license for construction work, and they can just go to pickup.construction.gov.ph, and encourage everyone from your business friends, from your government, all contractors conducting construction business with the government, or your friends are constructing their house, their house or being constructed by a contractor. Let them verify the contractor who's working for them, and you can check it in this particular online license verification website, /verify. So these are some blessings that were brought about by the pandemic. And then also there are many things that have happened in government, and I will just cite you one. For example, DPWH in September 29, 2020 issued Department Order 88, guidelines on the design of bicycle, so to encourage more non-motorized transport, and this is both healthy and at the same time encouraging social distancing. Now let me quickly go to outlook. So this is a 70-year chart of the GDP of the Philippines. This particular blue graph is the 70-year, and this is an average of around 5% annual growth in the last 70 years. Okay, and this is the COVID impact, 9.5%. And this is, as you can see, this is the worst dip in our GDP. But taking a look at it from a long-term perspective, we know that the Philippine economy is quite strong. Especially if you take a look at the gray bars behind this blue line, these are the net additional income from abroad. As you can see, from 1950 to 1990s, we did not have any net additional income from abroad. It was only since 1990 to 2020 to 2019 and up to now that we are receiving so much net additional income from abroad. In fact, no country in the world receives double-digit share to their domestic national income as far as net additional income from abroad. So thank you to our OFWs. Please thank your relatives who are OFWs. Kung meron kayong mga kamag-anak na OFWs, thank them, because literally they are the modern economic heroes of our time. So, and because of that, we know that this particular drop or the particular dip in our economic growth is temporary, and after we have vaccinated our people, we can go on and resume with our long-term economic growth momentum, because we know that we are supported with this amount of financial resources. The government may run into trouble with their debt to GDP ratio, which is now going at a worrisome rate, but the whole country is actually very awash with cash, and you can confirm it with any of your friends in the banking industry. Okay, so the outlook is the Philippine economy will still have a very strong economic growth momentum, and therefore, what's the translation to the construction industry? We will still have enough requirements, substantial requirements for the construction industry. Okay, and therefore, just to show you the how we are recovering so far, this is 2021 first half. No, see, a lot of our businesses are actually starting to recover, with the exception of other services, which are the public events, no? Weddings, baptism, etc., and then transport and storage, and then accommodation and food service activities, no? Which is very much relatable for all of us. No, we wanted to go to a restaurant right now. No, so we want to get out of our house. No, so as you can see, almost all our business sectors are starting to get the positive signs. Even the construction, which one of the biggest, is also registering positive numbers already. So, and what was driving that recovery of the construction industry? Let me show you very quickly the chart of the breakdown between government infrastructure and private construction. So you have red as government, and then you have a blue as the private sector. Remember, this blue line is 4 times the size of the government. And so some lessons here is that the government actually leads the way. As you can see here, whenever government really performs, the private sector will follow suit 1 to 2 quarters after. But when the government starts to slow down with their spending, you know that the private sector will follow also. No? And so when the government, through the build, 11 out of 14 quarters of double-digit growth, the private sector really accelerated to as much as 23%. No? However, through politics, there was political noise and squabbles. You have 3.5 months of budget delays in Congress, and that actually led to the private sector to slide down as well. No? So, but luckily, when the budget was signed, there was immediate growth towards the fourth quarter of 2019. However, the bad part there is once we have started recovering from that budget delay, then that's when COVID hit us, both government and private. Look at this one, no? the dive in the private construction. No? So, but what can you do? No? So this is investments, long-term investments. So these are the effect of lockdowns and budget cuts in infra. So we cut some of the budgets from the government agencies to actually reallocate it for health-related spending. No? So, but the government committed that it will build more, especially as a stimulus tool for against the pandemic. And so they have actually now delivered 25% increase in the first quarter and 50% increase in the second quarter. And we're very happy to see that the private sector has now gained positive numbers in the second quarter. So therefore, this is the importance of infrastructure spending, government leadership in build, and making sure that it still stimulates the economy through infrastructure. And may I just point out that this particular 19% in private construction is actually a result of household construction. Yung mga malalaki, hindi pa po nagre-recover. No? So let me go to this chart very quickly. So household construction actually accelerated at 286% increase in the second quarter versus second quarter of 2020. So parang ito yung tawag natin na revenge spending, no? So talagang parang lockdown nyo kami, we will now build our houses, we'll expand our houses to facilitate work from home, school from home, business from home, no? So and that one, because of that increase in household construction, it actually led to a lot of growth in construction-related manufacturing, like non-metallic mineral products, transport equipment, rubber and plastic products, electrical equipment, etc. So look at these numbers: 20, 40, 60, 80% growth. Okay, so. And we see that this one will continue to grow for 2021. This is actually a more than 40% increase from the 2020 reduced budget because of the pandemic to 1.1 trillion spending for 2021. So we're very happy to see that the government is trying its best to spend this all to impact the whole economy. And there's another 1 trillion for infrastructure for the following year. And this is good news and bad news. The national road, which is the responsibility of DPWH, is 98% paved already. So this is as of last month. But the local roads, responsibility of local government units. In general, the whole country is 18.85% paved, no? So remember that this is 177,000 of the 210,000 kilometers of road in the Philippines. So what am I saying here? I'm saying is that we have so much potential in terms of building our infrastructure. And imagine nyo lang po kung biglang ma-pave natin to, or kalahati lang ng lahat ng local roads ma-pave natin. Imagine the impact to construction, to logistics, to trade, to manufacturing, and to the whole economy, no? So, and that's why, no, the DPWH, for example, is pushing for these convergence programs. And I'm very happy, no? I was part, no, of the DPWH and the DOT team when it was being formulated. And Iloilo City and Iloilo Province should be very proud that you were one of the first areas where this particular program was formulated, no? So isa kayo sa mga naging pilot areas, including the one of C1 is actually a product of this program. Okay, so and we will see more of these collaboration efforts between national government agencies, DPWH, DOT, DTI, and the rest of the other agencies, no? So, and then some other areas. Regional economy, for the last 20 years, Western Visayas is very competitive, but I think you can grow even faster, no? In the last 2 years, this is your performance, and I think there are very competitive regions out there that you need to beat, and I think infrastructure and construction are big tools for you to utilize in order to accelerate your economic growth of the region. And this one is in terms of economy and the size of the land, no? Look at NCR, 0.2% of the total land area of the Philippines, and has 32% share of the GDP and growing at 6%. So Western Visayas, with the amount of land area, you can really build your infrastructure and grow your economy and rise above the rest, no? And this is, if NCR, for example, is the benchmark in terms of development, population density at 21,000 per square kilometer, so 21,000 people per square kilometer. Look at all these regions, and including Western Visayas at 380. So imagine the amount of upside growth that we are looking at between the Western Visayas and NCR, no? So in short, we barely just begun in terms of developing our region. Okay? And then some last items. You are very much aware of the Supreme Court ruling on the Mandanas Garcia cases, but basically there will be more money for LGUs because you will have more share because there's now a bigger pie for that particular sharing. No? So, and it will restructure how government will allocate infrastructure, and it will restructure how national government assists LGUs in building their own infrastructure. And there are opportunities for regional and local public-private partnerships and collaboration. And so as we can see, I would like to highlight these favorite projects of mine. No? So the Iloilo City Slaughterhouse Project, PPP project, and then very, very soon is also the Iloilo City Public Markets project. These are just two of the very, very important PPP projects for the region. No? So, and I think the national government, the PPP Center, will be happy to assist any city, municipality, or province in their pursuit of their PPP projects. And then, of course, lastly, for all the businesses out there, so Sir Matt was talking about ecosystems, green and blue infrastructure, green and blue economy. So in this particular chart, I'm talking about ecosystems of e-commerce businesses or e-commerce related businesses. So you're not gone are the days that we can actually treat each business or industry individually. Now, if we are to analyze industries, we have to analyze them from the point of view of their relationships, their ecosystems with one another. No? So, you will be seeing a lot of convergence between health and e-commerce, e-commerce and education, e-commerce, transport and logistics, agribusiness and e-commerce, agribusiness and digital technologies, and professional business services and e-commerce. All those will be actually combining with each other. So, and then so on the policy side, this is the last part of my presentation, would like you to be aware that there are efforts, now very important efforts related to infrastructure development. So there's a pending bill, 30-year National Infrastructure Program Act, or House Bill number 10319 by Congressman Romeo Momo and company, and then SB 2122 by Senator Pacquiao. And then you have the Public-Private Partnership Rationalization Act, which is the amendment of the BOT law, to further modernize it and to incorporate all these green principles that Sir Matt has actually enumerated. And then ongoing right now, I think NEDA has just announced a couple of days ago, I think the other day, that it is now pursuing the amendment of the BOT law implementing rules and regulation to further modernize our PPP framework. No? So, and that's why we keep on conducting all these policy dialogues in collaboration with the Construction Industry Authority of the Philippines of DTI and the other government agencies and legislators such as Congressman Salceda and Congressman Momo. So I'm happy to report to you that these are all consistent with what NEDA has actually formulated for all of us. No? It's especially the one below, if you will read the ones below. Ensure ecological integrity, clean and healthy environment, ensure safety and build resilience, infrastructure development accelerated, and operations sustained. So, super summary, the Philippine economy was okay before COVID-19 and we were more okay than other countries. The construction industry was very okay but prior to COVID-19 and it was driving the Philippine economy. During the COVID-19, we were and we are still not okay but trying to be okay. But we are used to always trying to be okay. Government infrastructure program provided substantial stimulus in the middle of the deep dive of the private sector. But 2022 and beyond, starting with the declaration of IMF way back in October last year, the worst is over. We're just talking about the right timing of a complete recovery of our economies. No? So therefore, we will be okay. It's just a matter of when. No? With the right mix of actions, we will be more okay. And with strategic choices, a new kind of okay. And I think SDG, no, Sustainable Development Goals, but to align with what Sir Matt has presented to you a while ago, shared, digital, green, and blue. Okay, no? And construction and infrastructure sector will build the foundation for this new okay. And lastly, we need to work together. National and local players, no, private and public sectors, foreign and domestic. No? So with that, I end my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Ronilo Balberan. You truly inspired us when you mentioned that infrastructure is truly the core to growth and development of our country, because it is the core of our quality life and to achieving better growth and then better climate and ensuring a sustainable development. It will directly contribute to achieving our objectives in terms of sustainable cities and communities and the region. And to mention a few, yung mga ibinigay mo po ay talagang very, very overwhelming. But I myself, as an ordinary citizen, is trying to really embrace what you have mentioned, because all of those are remarkable datas and then remarkable information in terms naman po sa development projects and program ng ating pong pamahalaan. Maraming salamat po.
Salamat po.
Okay, so we will now proceed to the open forum. I have taken the most often cited questions and I will be tossing them to our guest speakers this afternoon. We have very limited time, but we will try to bring out the questions that are very, very what do you call this, and timely. Okay, so if you have any questions for the presenters, please use the chat feature in our Zoom webinar. Okay, now the first question is for Mr. Hensley. Okay, so sir, we are talking about sustainable infrastructure, and there's a sense that it entails more than a simple checklist or a sense of do no harm. So could you talk about how your team is working on the framework for sustainable infrastructure?
Sure. Thank you for the question. It is more complicated than a simple checklist. I think developing the ecosystem is something that all countries should use kind of a blueprint for, because it does exist and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. I think do no harm, I think we're past that. I mean, I think we're moving into new areas of being more progressive, more dynamic, taking advantage of the technology that's available in the marketplace. But I think, but in terms of the government's responsibility to create the environment for that ecosystem, you know, it's really important that they take the lead. But the private sector has to be involved at the beginning in the co-creation of what that ecosystem should look like. You know, in some countries, you know, they call it public-private dialogue. In Singapore here, they have public-private alliances where the private sector is actually giving the government ideas in a, not in a bilateral way behind the scenes or behind closed doors, but in an open way where it's collaborative. So I really recommend that as a first step. More collaboration, more discussion, more creativity.
Yeah, because if there is more discussion, definitely it would enhance clarity and then reduce risk and then realize more opportunities that is a sustainable infrastructure for every country.
And it's also more, may I also say it's also more inclusive, because it's not just favoring the big firms. You know, we want small business to be a part of the solution in the Philippines. I think that's an important objective as well.
That's correct. Thank you. Now, we would like to toss this question to Professor Balberan. Sir, this was, I was able to take this question from the chat box. Now, the concept of sustainable development has been gaining popularity across various disciplines, including infrastructure. So to enhance sustainability in the Philippine construction industry, In what way national infrastructure network determine the priorities in maintaining economic success and environmental stability?
That's it seems like a finals question from a comprehensive exam. So the question is what in what way we can that the government can really push for the sustainability of for sustainable infrastructure. Well, there are two things, and that's why we are actually organizing a lot of dialogues with government, especially through the leadership of the Construction Industry Authority of the Philippines, which is actually composed of government and private sector in its board. No? So, what are those areas? Number one, a lot of this is number one shifting to digital, as Sir Matt has mentioned. No? So, we take the example of Singapore, which have actually digitalized their infrastructure planning and implementation and monitoring of their infrastructure. And what is the impact of that in terms of sustainability? You reduce something like 15 to 25% of waste. No? So because you have actually planned your infrastructure well, you have planned your road, your bridge, your building. So that means that you will be able to order enough, not just enough materials, and therefore you will lessen the materials being wasted in the process of your work and rework, and then variation orders, all of this. So you can actually reduce all of that, and imagine that amount of money, between 15 to 25%, and you know that particular building is produced optimally. So, but number two, of course, in terms of the use of materials that will have less impact on the environment. So the research on the work, for example, of the DOST in terms of the research on construction materials. No? I think I saw a representative from DOST a while ago. No, I think she's still here. No, she Miss Leia Rose. No, so I think there's that work from DOST to continue that research work with DPWH, DOTR, and BOI, no, Board of Investment, to really incentivize the use of new materials for construction that actually require less carbon, no, and that will actually contribute to sustainability. So two things, no, immediately: the digitalization, the digital transformation of both private construction companies and the government in terms of planning, implementation, and monitoring. And then number two, immediately, is the use of new materials that have less carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's good. Digitalization, planning, because the Philippines or our country must be very, very keen, definitely, to develop civil construction networks while ensuring green construction. Just to be very, very particular with the domains also of constructions like buildings, roads, and railways networks. That's
Yeah.
very, very good, sir. Thank you. Now, I would like to ask this last question to Mr. Hensley. Sir, this was given to me by the Iloilo Business Club. What do you think are the challenges in implementing sustainable infrastructure development projects in the Philippines?
Well, again, that's a strategic, question. I think that the biggest challenge, as I said before, I don't really see the financing issue as the biggest challenge, even though it used to be. And of course, that's always going to be a challenge on a project by project basis. But I think the biggest challenge is really getting the portfolio of opportunities established and getting a pipeline of viable projects in each sector. It could be in the green building sector, it could be in the transport sector, but getting that pipeline of viable projects that are assembled in a rigorous way so that they meet a certain standard. So this is a public sector responsibility, but it's a private sector challenge to develop projects that meet a certain standard. And once they meet that standard, then they can move forward to the financing phase and have a better chance of attracting the type of green finance that we've been discussing today. So to me, it's starting at the early stage, screening and developing of eligible projects at a high standard.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is my last question for Professor Balberan, because we're running out of time. Are there available tools, sir, or criteria to local governments determine the sustainability of infrastructure projects?
Well, I think no, with our discussions with the DPWH, I think also in relation to the implementation of the Supreme Court ruling on the Mandanas Garcia cases, all the national government, especially DPWH, is required to produce this devolution transition plan, no, as required by the Executive Order 138. In compliance with the Supreme Court ruling. No? So, what am I saying? So, that particular devolution transition plan would include these capacity building and collaboration activities between the national government and the LGU, and together with actually the private sector and civil society organization. And I believe the deadline has already expired, and I think the national governments have submitted those devolution transition plan. And I think, no, and I've seen the devolution transition plan of DPWH, and they will be working through their regional offices and the district offices. I believe mga friends nyo rin yan sa Iloilo Business Club, no. They will use the regional offices and the district engineering offices to organize all these dialogues, so we can actually produce this particular digital transformation, criteria on sustainable development, identification of the convergence programs that national government can construct this major infrastructure project, but local government unit can also take on a smaller infrastructure project that is affordable for them. So together, we can both fund major and minor infrastructure projects, and private sector can actually offer their own money to build PPP projects that then we can combine all these sustainability principles. So that's what we are also trying to facilitate these dialogues. And watch out, no, it will be rolled out, that devolution transition plan will be rolled out by DPWH in the next coming weeks. I see a lot of representatives from the municipalities here of the LGUs of Region 6, and expect that you will be contacted by the respective regional offices and district engineering offices of DPWH, as well as the other agencies of national government. So I think I would not go into the details of that, but rest assured that that will be the core of our discussions, of our collaborative work, national and local. No? Yun po yun, Ms. Rowena.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope Professor Balberan was able to satisfy the question of one of the members of the Iloilo Business Club. So we're getting close to the end of our time together on this webinar. To our guest speakers, this is one last question for the both of you. If there is one thing that you would like our audience to take away from this session, what would it be? I'll start with you, Professor Ronilo.
The key word now is collaboration. So, and in fact, kung magdadagdag ako, digital collaboration, because this is the only way for us to collaborate right now. So, but digital collaboration in all forms, no? So, hindi lang to about webinars, no? We are promoting digital collaboration in engineering. You know, yung pagpa-plan ng mga infrastructure, both the private sector and the government. Wala na to yung mga gumagamit tayo ng mga papel, tapos pabura-bura ka. So, ang daming, di ba? Ang daming sayang, ang daming mali, etc. So, we have to enable digital collaboration, most especially in this biggest high-impact industry, which is called construction industry. So, everything will be about digital collaboration if we have hopes of stronger and faster economic growth for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ronilo. Mr. Hensley.
Thank you. Well, in addition to collaboration, which is really all about partnerships, I would really say it's about vision, having the courage to demand that the public sector and the private sector have a vision and raise the bar, raise the standard of what Filipinos should expect when it comes to sustainable lives. You know, it's at the end of the day, it's really about quality of life, quality of our planet, quality of our children. So I think it's the collaboration to take a vision to a higher standard. I think we all deserve that.
Mhm. Thank you very much. On that note, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel. And finally, we come to the end part of our webinar. And I would like to say thank you to our esteemed guest speakers, Mr. Matthew Hensley, President, Planet Partnerships and Senior Consultant of USAID Deliver Project, and Professor Ronilo Balberan, Vice President, Reed Foundation and Team Leader for Infrastructure, USAID Deliver Project. We have learned that infrastructure is truly critical to sustainable community development and our future well-being and the day-to-day lives of individual Filipinos. The next decade will likely witness a surge in sustainable infrastructure supported by sustainable finance, with the objective of meeting the infrastructure needs and the common individual, helping the environment and creating the social benefits for communities around the world. I hope today's episode has been beneficial for everyone. Always remember, the infrastructure we are building today will shape tomorrow's communities and key to how citizens perceive the role and the effectiveness of the government. Again, I am Rowena Diaz saying thank you for the opportunity to function as moderator in today's episode. Thank you all for participating. And I hope that the two speakers was able to enlighten all of you with your concerns. So thank you very much and have a great day, everyone. You may now disconnect from the call. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate
Yeah.
it. Bye-bye. Happy
Thank you.
anniversary. Yeah.